Hey everybody, today we are going to introduce a topic that is very, very fun to talk about and very unique, and it's what we call behavioral ecology. So, a behavior is something that is observable, and it's something that is usually what we call a coordinated response to some kind of stimuli. And there's a lot of research that has gone into studying these behaviors, and there's a lot of science that goes into them as well. In humans, we have a whole division of science called psychology, where we look at the brain and how it's impacted by some of these behaviors. And so the idea is that many of these originated with genes and how they create some of the tissues, the organs that the creature has. And so, with this chapter specifically, we're dealing with more so animal behaviors, but we also want to understand that even something like a bacteria or a fungi or a plant, they also react and respond to their environment. In fact, that's one of our characteristics of life is that things respond to stimuli. But specifically, we're going to deal more so with animal behaviors in this chapter. So, with genes and behavior, there's always some variation in behavior based on genetics. So if you have, let's say, a bunch of male robins, they might have a slightly different song because of their genetics and what they might have inherited. Or you also might have a behavior that maybe is a physical display. So, for example, you might have one ruffed grouse that maybe drums a different way than another ruffed grouse. And so there's a lot of genetic basis to how behaviors change. One of the examples is a scientist by the name of Arnold looked at garter snakes and looked at how some garter snakes really enjoyed the taste of a slug, where other ones really were, for lack of a better phrase, they didn't like the taste of the slugs. And so he did a study where he looked at, all right, garter snakes, and one of their diets, they eat a lot of like insects. They eat some rodents, but it's actually a lot of insects because they're such a small snake. And looked at the garter snake and looked at a different grouping of them and genetics of them and saw, did that change their taste? Did it change their drive to eat those slugs? And so not only is there a genetic basis to a lot of our behavior, but then we also have hormones that are going to influence our behavior. Now, this we certainly can see more evidently even in humans, but we also see it in the spring with songbirds. So notice how in the wintertime, in the fall, and even in the summer, there's not as much bird communication. But if you were to open your windows in the spring or early summer, sometimes you have to close your windows because birds are singing all the time, and sometimes we might find it annoying. We know that because hormone levels change during the seasons, just like how white-tailed deer have a rut, elk have a rut. There are certain mating times for creatures where some creatures they might mate all throughout the year. So when we look at behaviors, there's a genetic component, there's a hormonal component, there's all these different components that influence what a behavior will turn on or also can be turned off. So let's first of all talk about what we call instincts or instinct behavior. This is something that the creature does without having to learn it, meaning that they're born with it. And that's what we mean by that genetic basis. It's not taught, it's a reaction. And so, somewhere in their genes, they know that they have to do this. And so, an example of this would be a baby bird. What do baby birds do when their mom or dad lands on their nest? Well, the first thing they do is they open up their beak. At the same time, parents also know that this is something that they need to do. This is something that they have to provide parental care. So this bird is actually not even this is not the dad of this bird. But because the egg was in its nest, this dad thinks, "Oh, this is my son. He's just really big." And so you're seeing a couple different instincts here. You're seeing the instinct of the baby bird opening the mouth when what he thinks is his dad is bringing him food, and you're also seeing the instincts of the male providing food to what he thinks is the offspring. Another one, a human context of this, is when we are babies, we will often mimic and instinctively copy the facial expressions of someone that might be holding us, especially our parents. So instincts are just that. They are not learned, they're something that we're born with. Now, the majority of behaviors, however, are learned. And these behaviors are those that are going to change with experience. Just like how we in the school system have you guys work up in grades, some of these are based on time as well as experience. If I tried to teach a 7-year-old algebra, that wouldn't be a good idea because they don't have the concrete skills that you need, basic addition and subtraction. The same thing holds true with our learned behaviors in nature. So, some examples of learned behavior that we're going to talk about: imprinting, conditioning, habituation, spatial learning. Those are all learned as time goes on. And so, I just kind of like looking at different examples of these. So, first of all, imprinting. This is super important and is based on a very time sensitive situation. So sometimes you might have heard of, if you're, again, sticking with humans here, you really want to make sure that you read to your baby, you read to your infant, because it helps them develop sounds, it helps them develop the basis of vocabulary. The timing is also true with other creatures, and a very cool example here is young geese will figure out a mother-like creature at a very specific time in their life. So what happened here is that this scientist noticed that the mother of these goslings died. And the scientist felt bad, and so he's like, well, I'm going to make sure that these baby geese are able to live. And so he started feeding them, he started checking up on them. Well, at this very time sensitive time, this imprinting time, the goslings are like, hey, that's our mom or that's our dad. And so they started following him around. They associated that time sensitive frame, they were being taken care of. And so that's kind of how they came to be during this very specific time period. Now, those of you that are in or have taken psychology before, there's a very famous study done by Pavlov where he looked at a stimulus, and with that stimulus came a response. Specifically, with his, he rang a bell every time that he fed dogs. Rang a bell, fed the dogs. Rang a bell, fed the dogs. Then what he did is he rang the bell but didn't feed the dogs. However, the dogs still salivated. So what happened was they had associated that sound with a key to eating. And so we sometimes will get this called a classical conditioning. So salivation became part of feeding. Another type of conditioning is what's called operant conditioning, and this is a voluntary action becomes associated with its consequences. So some examples. A toad may attempt to eat a wasp with a black and gold pattern and then get stung. After that, the toad says, I'm done with that. I'm not going to be dealing with that anymore. I don't want to get stung. And so oftentimes with this type of conditioning, it's a negative consequence. We might see this with like, okay, all of us have probably burnt our hand on a stovetop. From then on, we don't want to touch a hot stovetop. And so that would be an example of a voluntary action is associated with consequences. All right, so those are our first couple. Now let's get into habituation. So what this means is that basically an organism has become so familiar with its area that it knows what to and not to be scared of. And scared is probably not the best word. But for example, those of you that have hunted before, and let's say you're deer hunting and you see a deer, and then all of a sudden a squirrel comes out. Does that deer run like crazy away from a squirrel? No, it doesn't. It has developed and figured out that that squirrel is not a threat. If you turkey hunt and all of a sudden a rabbit hops along, that turkey doesn't strut at the rabbit. It doesn't run away from the rabbit. And so habituation is just basically getting used to their environment and what is either good or bad. Now, at the same token, if a white-tailed deer sees a wolf, then the whitetail flashes up, they're out of there. A moose knows to stay the heck away from a wolf. The example that they're giving here is that pigeons, or let's say squirrels that live in the city, know that for the most part, people aren't going to harm them. Along the same lines as habituation is another type of behavior that's called spatial learning. And essentially, what this means is that the organism knows where stuff is. It has created a mental map of where to get stuff. So if you are, let's say, a beaver, you know where the aspen trees are that are a big part of your diet. You know where your dam is. You maybe know where coyotes come and feed and you want to stay away from them. And so it's basically getting used to the environment that they live in. So the examples that they're showing here are that squirrels know where their food is stored. They know where their water is. They know where maybe other squirrels live. And so just getting used to your environment and where you live. Another type of learning is what we call insight learning. And if we just read the phrase here, an animal solves a problem without trial and error attempts. So, for example, you might see a bird sitting on a branch and kind of checking stuff out before it goes and gets something. Or it might look from afar at what other birds are doing before it's safe. So that's insightful learning. And here they're giving the example of when chimpanzees were captive, they showed learning like when they stacked boxes to reach food. So they were thinking, okay, I need to get to that food. How do I do it? And so they came up with a pattern in order to do so. So those are our first types of learning. And as we continue, we'll talk about some of the other types of behaviors.